Here on BBC One, the first of a special Panorama series of interviews with the party leaders. Tonight, David Dimbleby questions the leader of the Labour Party, Tony Blair.
Mr. Blair, in this election, you're asking the electorate to put their trust in you, the new Blair. Isn't there a problem that there is an old Blair who believed quite different things, which makes it rather difficult for people to trust the new one?
No, I don't agree at all. I mean, we have been through a big process of change and modernisation in the Labour Party. That is absolutely true. But it's been a process of change that I think has been well worth undertaking. And as you probably know, throughout my time in the Labour Party, I've wanted to move the Labour Party on from positions it's held in the past in order to get the proper modernised Labour Party that we have today. New Labour is very much what I believe in. It's very much my own creation.
But did you believe in old Labour?
I believed in the values of the Labour Party, yes.
No, did you believe in what they stood for? Did you believe in CND? Did you believe in union power not being curtailed? Did you believe in nationalisation, no privatisation?
There were a whole series of policy positions that I adopted along with the rest of the Labour Party, but the very process of modernisation has been the very process that I have undertaken in the Labour Party.
I know that,
For
but
example,
have you abandoned, yes. Did you believe what you said you believed in the 80s?
Look, of course, we always believed in the idea of a more just and more fair society, and the Labour Party believed for a long period of time that the way to do that was, for example, greater nationalisation, was, for example, simply more increased state spending. The whole process of modernisation, David, has been to take the Labour Party away from that, to keep true to its principles, but put those principles properly in a modern setting.
So all that was wrong?
No, I don't say all that was wrong.
Most of it was wrong.
I simply say what is important is to apply those principles to the modern world. Look, for example, I mean, John Major stood in the 1970s on a platform of Scottish devolution. Margaret Thatcher was the person that closed more grammar schools than anyone else. She was a member of Ted Heath's government. You know, times move on. I mean,
but it pales into insignificance compared with what you stood for in 83 and 87.
No, I don't think it does, actually. But in any event, let me say to you, my whole time within the Labour Party, I mean, let us just be realistic about this. From the moment that I came into the Labour Party, I've argued that it had to change and modernise and update itself. I was the person who, when I was the Treasury spokesman for the Labour Party, was arguing that we had to stand up for the rights of small investors. I was the person, when I got into the shadow cabinet, that withdrew our support for the closed shop. I was the shadow Home Secretary that was the person that said Labour had to toughen its stance on law and order, that we had to stand up for the rights of the citizen against the criminal. I was the person that argued the case.
And you were the
changes
person,
in the union
and
relationship.
And you were the person, as a barrister who dealt with trade union affairs, who sat on a select committee and who opposed root and branch every detail of the Conservative government's attempts to reform, to even make the most modest reforms in trade union law.
David, those are in the days when people thought that the best way to look at collective bargaining arrangements between employer and employee was not to have a legal framework. We changed that. And let me say something to you. I'm proud of the changes that the Labour Party has made.
No, but hang on. I'm asking you about what happened before. You may be proud of what you've done now.
Look,
that implies you're ashamed of what happened before.
I'm not ashamed of it at all.
Well, was your instinct right, for instance, when you talked about the Tories as people with hobnailed boots ready to trample over the rights of trade unionists? I mean, is that something you defend saying now? Did you mean to say it?
Look, at that time, people thought, for perfectly understandable reasons, that the best way to have an industrial relations framework was to get the law out of it. That changed. Indeed, I was one of those people that changed that position of the Labour Party.
The Conservative Party were in the van on this. They decided that it was right to have a framework of law.
If I can just finish this. The Labour Party itself had the chance to do this back in the 1960s within place of strife. That attempt failed. As I've said myself often, it would have been better if that attempt had succeeded. But I'm afraid that this sort of Conservative propaganda, that I was some sort of extreme left-winger that suddenly trimmed after I became Labour leader, I was the person who was at the forefront of all the moves to modernise the Labour Party. And yes, we've changed. And I make no apology for saying that we've changed, because we had to get the Labour Party up to date to apply those values, of fairness and justice and opportunity for all, but in a different world. That's why I say, for example,
but hold on a second. I
want to complete the changes that the Labour Party have made. That is why, when I became leader of the Labour Party, we rewrote the Labour Party's constitution to put a commitment to private enterprise alongside that of social justice. We've changed our relations with the trade unions. We've changed the way that we make policy. We've now reformed the way that members of Parliament are selected.
You're not an old man. You haven't been in politics very long. And only a decade ago, you were talking about hobnail boots trampling on the rights of trade unionists, pernicious bills to control trade unions. Now you say, oh, well, we were wrong in the 70s. And by the way, I'm not quite sure where we were in the 80s. But anyway, we've changed it all now. That was what you believed in. You defended it with the same passion that you defend the changes you're making now.
What I said to you a moment or two ago was that the Labour Party believed, as a whole, that it was best to get the law out of industrial relations, but times have moved on. I mean, David, we can sit here arguing about what happened in the 1970s and early 1980s.
Well, it's quite important because you were there.
Yes, exactly. And I was the person probably above anybody else who argued the case for modernising the Labour Party. And as I say to you, this notion that somehow, you know, Tony Blair was a sort of extreme left-winger, and now he's suddenly popped up.
I never said you were an extreme left-winger. You were central to what the Labour Party stood for, which you may define as extreme left-wing at that period.
And central to changing it so that our values lived again for the modern world.
All right.
Look, New Labour, the whole concept of New Labour is about recognising change. And I think the people... No, but hang on a minute.
But I'll come to New Labour in a moment.
You put this question to me, and it's a question of integrity, and it's a question of trust, and I want to answer it. We created New Labour. We call it New Labour precisely in order to be honest with people about the changes that have been made. We recognise, I've recognised throughout this election, there are certain things the Conservatives got right in the 1980s, and we should have been quicker to face up to that. But there are certain things that they got wrong. And what New Labour has been about providing is an alternative the people of this country have been crying out for. So, not winding the clock back to the past and not staying with a tired and discredited Conservative party.
So was Britain right not to vote in a Labour government in 1983, in 1987 and in 1992, in your opinion?
No, of course not. I supported the Labour Party.
What, Britain should have elected a Labour government under Michael Foot in 83?
Of course I wanted them to.
Unilateral disarmament?
David, please. Of course I wanted the Labour Party to be elected. I stood as a Labour Party candidate. But if you're trying to suggest to me that somehow the changes that we have made are superficial or not something we believe in, that is absurd. We have produced probably the greatest transformation in any political party that has been done in recent decades. And let me just tell you this, the Conservatives have changed too, you know. The Conservatives changed their position throughout the 1970s. They got away from what they saw was the muddle-headedness of Ted Heath and all the rest of it, and the new Thatcherites came in and took over. The idea that the Labour Party is the only party that has ever undergone a process of change, but the principles remain the same. That's why if you look at our programme today, you will see extending educational opportunity, tackling youth unemployment.
Yes, no, but hang on a shopping list. I'll come to that.
Never mind about shopping lists, David. The fact of the matter is we have made these changes in a way that is entirely consistent with principle.
We'll explore them. Just before we do, one other question. Your new ally, Rupert Murdoch, was he right to take on at Wapping the print unions, and was Labour wrong to support the unions against him?
Look, these days are past.
I know they are past.
They are past and gone, and there's no point in going back.
Were you right in doing so?
We believe that these changes could have been done in a different way, but there is no point in going back over the past. There is a different world today. Let us address this world today, and let us see how we can make improvements to it. Let us see how we can make Britain a better place. And I repeat to you, I think it is very important that people understand we are not going to roll the clock, turn the clock back, roll back the tide. We're not going back to the past, but we are offering a better Britain for the future.
All right, let's look at the future under Labour if you're returned to office. You've accepted the Tory spending plans for the first 2 years of a government, if you form a government, and as we now know, there is a hole in that of £1.5 billion. Are you going to fill that gap, as has been widely said in the last few days, by privatisations?
We're going to do it in precisely the way that Gordon Brown has suggested, which is that we will undertake a review of the national assets, we'll compile a proper national register of the assets that are there, something indeed the Conservatives should have done before, and we'll see if there are ways in which we can meet that shortfall. But let me just put 2 points to you.
Wait a minute.
First of all, well, you can come back to it in a moment. Let me just put 2 points to you. First of all, this is the Conservatives that have left us in a situation where privatisation proceeds have to pay for current expenditure. It's the Conservatives who have got this problem. Now, we will have to face this problem and inherit it if we are elected, but it is a problem that has come about as a result of the Conservatives' mismanagement
But
of
it's
the
almost
economy and the doubling
unbelievable
of
that the Labour
national debt.
Party, it's almost unbelievable that the Labour Party, who only at the last conference were talking about renationalising rail, absolutely ruling out nationalising the air control systems, traffic control, should now suddenly be talking both about asset stripping, as I understand it, of the wealth of the country.
We're not talking about asset stripping.
Well, you're selling off
That's what I'm
assets.
saying,
Well, what is it?
No, of course it's not asset stripping. We're compiling
Selling
a
the
register.
silver.
No, we're compiling a register of those assets that are in the public sector in order to see if there are those that can be better off in the private sector and raise finance. And, for example, we said when the government sold the Ministry of Defence homes last year, we didn't say in principle it's wrong. We had very strong objections to the way that it was being done and the deal that was being secured for the public sector. We didn't object in principle on the railways. Indeed, it's been John Prescott who said, let's get private finance into the railway system. And the reason that we have had to say, in relation to rail, as with water, we oppose the privatisations for perfectly good reasons, but we can't renationalise them, is because the Conservatives have privatised these industries and squandered the money. The money's gone.
You've never talked in this manifesto, you never talked at the last conference about Labour having a positive programme for privatising. I mean, are you saying you are going to privatise the air traffic control?
We will certainly look at that, as indeed
You're not ruling it
made.
out, in
We
other words.
don't rule it out, and we can't rule it out, because the Conservatives, as you rightly
Well,
say,
you could put up
have left us-
taxation. You could do a whole
Yes,
lot of
but we
other
don't
things
want to do
do
that.
Ah, well, you can't blame the Tories for the way they conduct their affairs
No,
and say,
I'm
we've
very
got
sorry.
to do it.
You certainly can blame them for the way they've mismanaged
Yes,
the
but
public
you've got
finance.
other measures you could take. You don't have to follow
Yes, you
their
do have
their
other measures that you could take, but they're not measures that we would want
Many
to take.
people think you should put up taxation.
Yes, but I don't happen to think that.
All right.
Now, if I may, no, you've asked me the
Yes, go
question,
on.
so I think I should complete the answer. The plain fact is, if you don't look at that, then because of the way that they have mismanaged the finances, because they have doubled the national debt, because we've got such huge problems on borrowing, then we will have to look at those things that can fill that hole left by the privatisation proceeds. But you said it wasn't in the manifesto. You will actually find in the manifesto, under the section dealing with public finance, that we will conduct a review of all public spending and make sure that all departments conduct their spending in a way that roots out waste and inefficiency.
Yeah, but it doesn't say anything about selling off assets.
Well,
I mean, every
that could be
government
one way
says
of doing that.
government says we're going to review central spending and try and be more efficient. You don't say there we'll think about privatising air traffic control or parcel force, or we'll consider selling off assets that the state owns. I mean, there would have been
with
mayhem if
respect-
you'd said that. You only said it yesterday.
I'm sorry, that is absolute.
Well, I've just read it out. It's not
Yeah,
there.
but what we say there very clearly is that there should be a review of the way that government manages its spending.
Yeah.
And if I may just point out to you, local government has been selling assets over a considerable period of time. So the idea that there's anything odd about this doesn't follow from that we agree with every privatisation of the Conservatives. I mean, if you look at what's happened, for example, with many of their privatisations, they've been selling off monopoly public services, often at a knockdown price, and then as we see with the appalling situation in our railways, it can often lead to poorer services for the customer and very large windfall profits that are not justified. But, you know, you asked me earlier about the changes in the Labour Party. The basic change was surely this, that we were rewriting Clause 4 of the party constitution to make it clear, as we say in the new Clause 4, that those essential goods and services that are essential for the public should either be owned by the public or accountable to them. We dropped the commitment that nationalisation as a matter of doctrine had to go forward. So these changes that we're making, I mean, again, I come back to the point that I'm saying to you. I am pleased that the Labour Party is a modern, forward-looking party today. And I think people, again, in this country would welcome a government that's not going to take a dogmatic, doctrinal view, say everything in the public sector is good or everything in the public sector is bad. Make up our minds on what actually works. What counts is what works.
Of course, there are a lot of assets you can look at. You've talked about the Ministry of Defence. That's been leaked. The National Health Service has a lot of assets too. Hospitals and land and property of all kinds that could be sold and leased back quite effectively. Would you consider that, or is that ruled out?
The private finance initiative that the government's undertaken, this we accept insofar as it relates to clinical services.
But that's for new building. I'm talking about the assets the NHS presently has. Would you consider selling any of those off, or do you rule that out?
No, we certainly don't want to sell off assets that are an essential part of a proper National Health Service.
Do you rule out selling off any of the assets of the National Health Service?
No, we've already said to you on the private finance initiative of the Conservatives that they have underway at the moment. We are perfectly happy for there to be a relationship between public and private sector. What we are opposed to, which is what the Conservatives are trying to do, is to end up in a situation where you are privatising basic clinical services. Okay. We're not in favour of that at all. Okay. But I should make it quite clear to you, as I've said again, the changes that we want in the National Health Service are changes that allow us to get back to the basic principles of the National Health Service, run it as a proper public service again, right. Not end up in a situation where we're spending hundreds of millions of additional pounds in bureaucracy and administration, not providing a better service for the patient.
You've said throughout, and I suppose you will go on saying, that the essence of this campaign is that you should be trusted on everything you say. New Blair, New Labour, they should both be trusted. I want to turn to tax. You've made it absolutely clear as a promise, as a guarantee, that you won't raise the rates of income tax for the 5 years of a parliament. Now, many people may think that that means their tax bills won't rise for the 5 years of a parliament. Is that what you mean them to understand?
Now, I've been asked this question about the tax burden that people will pay, and what I point out is that, of course, under the Conservatives' proposals, under the Conservatives' Red Book figures in their budget, the tax burden is set to rise over the next few years.
We're speaking about what Labour will do, not about what's in the Tories' Red Book.
David, if you would just allow me to finish. I am pointing out the fact that even under Conservative proposals, the tax burden is going to rise, and precisely for that reason, I cannot give commitments that the Labour Party can do other than that.
Right. I don't want to confuse people unduly, but the tax rises that are in the Red Book are to do with the natural increase in tax as people get wealthier. They're not to do with increased taxation.
I'm sorry.
What I'm asking is, are you going to put up taxation?
No, I've already said to you, we are committed to ensuring that the basic and top rate of tax does not rise. The tax burden is due to go up under the Conservatives, but my point to you is this. There are no hidden spending commitments in the Labour Party programme.
Well, I didn't ask you about that.
Require hidden taxes.
I didn't ask you about that.
I know you didn't ask me about that.
I'm asking you about taxation. I come to the spending. I want to just ask you about taxation.
But taxation is as a result of spending. And if you would just allow me to complete the point, there are no hidden spending commitments that require hidden taxes. I'm not going to sit here and write a budget for you.
Of course not.
I'm not going to go through all the various reliefs and allowances and go through each one. Yeah. But the two things that people are able to know about the Labour Party is, one, we've given that commitment on the basic and top rate of tax not going up over the lifetime of this Parliament, and two, our spending programme is properly and fully costed.
Yes.
And in addition to that, we've said, as we can, we'll try and get the tax bills of ordinary families down.
But
I would like to get them down.
Yes, but as you must know, going around the country, everybody believes that whatever government is returned on May the 1st, one of the first things they will have to do is to increase taxes, because the public finances are in a mess, because the borrowing requirement is too high, because the taxation may not come in. And I don't want to go through all the details, but is there anything in allowances, in tax relief on mortgages?
Hold on. What you want me to do? You want me to write a budget?
On VAT, on national insurance rates, are there any of those that you would rule out? Or should people expect that if Labour has to raise tax, it may go for any of those things?
No, they certainly shouldn't expect that, but what I'm saying to you is this. I'm not going to end up writing a budget. I would give you the same answer as Kenneth Clarke if he was sitting here. What I can say to you is that any programmes that we have that require the spending of money, for example, just to run through them, we've said that we will reduce class sizes for all 5-, 6 and 7-year-olds, funded by phasing out the assisted places scheme. We will spend more money in the National Health Service, spent by reducing the appalling and rising costs of bureaucracy administration. We will have the windfall levy on the excess profits of the privatised utilities. That will allow us to put in place a programme to get the long-term and young unemployed back into the workplace. So there are a whole series of measures which require the spending of money, but in each case, any spending programme that we have is properly costed and financed. Now that, in my view, is what people are entitled to know. In addition, of course, they want to know what our principles are in the tax system. And those principles are to encourage work, to encourage opportunity, to encourage investment, to encourage savings. And if we can, I don't make this as a commitment or a guarantee, but if we can, I would like to do a starting rate of tax of 10 pence.
Yes,
because
you
we
see,
brought down taxes for people at the top end. It's time to do something for those at the bottom end.
People may believe you'll be able to do that in 5 years, but you set out, as you say, to have very few spending commitments and not to increase tax rates.
Yes, and of course, the reason why we've had to have...
Yes, but can I just finish the question? Because you've been... Yes, but you carry on with yours. Let me just...
I know, but
let me
you
put the
said...
question.
No, hang on a minute. You said that we couldn't. You said that we had to stick to the government spending limits, as if that was some sort of criticism.
I didn't say you chose to. I didn't say you had to.
Of course, we have had
Labour
to do that.
chose to do that. You could have done other things.
We did that precisely because of the state of the public finances that we will inherit.
If those indeed are your tax plans, and there isn't any serious new spending, I don't count the spending on education, which is peanuts. I don't count. It's peanuts. It's 1% of the school's budget. You're talking about. It's a tiny sum of money.
No, I don't accept that. Let me explain to you.
It's 1%. Well, let me just finish the question. You're spending 1%. You're proposing to increase by 1% the spending on education, and yet you say my priority is education, education, education. This is rhetoric, isn't it? This is an example of just blather, which isn't going to be supported by proper funding and proper spending plans.
Right, well, let me answer that point. First of all, there are 3 different ways in which we could spend money far better and more effectively in education. The first is not to subsidise a small number of children at private school, but to reduce class sizes for all 5, 6 and 7-year-olds. I mean, there are around about 1 million children that can benefit from that. Secondly, we don't believe the nursery voucher scheme is right. We will replace that with proper nursery education. Thirdly, we have said, as you get the welfare bills down, these appallingly high bills for social and economic failure under the Conservatives, then you can release more money into education and health and the services where you really want them. But it isn't just about spending money, you know. Education isn't just about spending money. You look at some of the other things that we're proposing.
No, but hang on, you're the people who complain that our spending is falling below the OECD average, that we're only spending 5.1%, not 5.8%. That you know that there's over £3 billion needed for restoring schools, getting inside lavatories and all that. And then you say, oh, education isn't about spending, not just about spending. No, there are massive things in David, education that are about spending.
Of course, and I've said there are various ways in which we can increase expenditure on education. I've just given you examples of that. But what I'm saying to you is it's not just about spending money. I mean, the commitment that we have, of course, is over the lifetime of the Labour government to increase spending on education as a proportion of our national income, as we reduce it on the costs of social failure and long-term and youth unemployment. That I believe that we can do as a result of the programmes that we put forward. But it isn't just about money.
But why not save a bit more? Why not save a bit more? You've got privatisation now. You've now got these assets you've announced you're going to sell. Why not use those for improving education?
Well, you know,
why have you agreed to keep the Eurofighter on? £15.5 billion.
Because it's essential for the it's essential for the defence of our country.
Defence less important now, according to your manifesto. A defence...
Now, hang on, we're not saying defence is less important. Defence is extremely important for this country. It's the first duty of any government to defend our country, and we'll do so. But I want to come back, if I might, to education. And you're saying, well, it's all about money. It's not all about money. Look, if you got, for example, at every school, supposing you put the Labour programme into practice, you know, in every school, we've got a situation where we're going to target those schools that are failing or not improving sufficiently, and put in place a programme to raise the standards there. Head teachers to have a proper qualification for competence. Reform of teacher training. Modernising the comprehensive system so that instead of going back to the 11 plus, we take account of the different abilities of the children. Literacy and numeracy guarantees. Our programme that we put forward, even in opposition, under the chairmanship of Dennis Stevenson, the businessman, to get new technology into the schools. These things would make a dramatic difference. Broadening the A-level syllabus. Reforming higher education funding, you know,
but still
bringing into being a university industry that gives you the chance to get access to the best.
But all schemes, but still no real money spending.
There are real money too. Look, what do people in this country want us to do?
Money spent on education, we're told, according to the polls, above all else. Education, education, education,
yes,
and spend more money on
some of the ways that they can do that. But
if you want to achieve it.
That's not all that they want. What they want most of all is a government that's going to make a fresh start on tackling the problems of this country. They've had huge tax rises under the Tories. The Tories are spending large sums of money. We can't just go on taxing, spending more. We've got to look at how we spend that money, and we've got to look at where the tax burden falls. Now, I believe that we can make a real start on education in this country. And let me tell you, if we are elected, it won't be just the priority of our government for a day and then forgotten again like this lot. It will be the priority of our government right the way through that term of office, and it will be driven through right from the very top.
We must move on, I'm afraid, because we don't have all that much time. I want to talk to you about, or ask you a question about Europe. Do you agree with what Robin Cook said, that it's unlikely that we'll join the single currency during the next Parliament?
Yes, I think he was speaking no more than an accurate prediction of what's likely to happen.
Why can't Labour just be straight about this and say what many people believe, instead of giving all these hints? Look, you can forget the issue until after the election. It's not germane until the next Parliament.
Because we have a long-established policy, which is sensible and important. It is important also that Britain remains part of the negotiations, because we are going to be affected by the single currency. Frankly, whether we're in or out of the single currency, we're going to be affected by it. And I want to see Britain adopting a relationship in Europe where we can lead again.
So it's not ruled out joining this thing in the next Parliament?
The option remains open, as indeed Robin himself said, but you know, it is a matter of common sense for obvious reasons. It is highly unlikely we'll be in the first wave, and that then reduces the probability, as Robin was saying, that you'd enter in the next Parliament. But the option remains open, and what is essential in Europe is we start to rebuild a relationship in this country where we're leading again in Europe.
How do you do that?
We do it by going out with an agenda for reform in Europe and ensuring that the position of Britain is not determined, as it is in the Conservative Party, by internal party divisions, but determined by genuine British interest. Now,
you said a curious thing about one aspect of this. You said that you were going to join, as we know you are, the social chapter, and we know that that gives up over a certain range of subjects Britain's veto, and you then said, when asked about this, that you would insist on getting your way on the social chapter. How can you insist on getting your way if you've given up Britain's veto?
Look, the importance of being part of the social chapter is that an empty chair policy is not sensible. But what worries business is not what is in the social chapter now.
I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about the word insist. Now, how do you insist? I'm sorry, I must insist on my question.
Right.
How do you insist if you've given up a veto?
Because I was just about to explain to you the key areas that business is concerned about. Social security costs being imported in from abroad requires unanimity. Now, that's why we can insist upon it. And furthermore, we have made it absolutely clear in any negotiations over the social chapter that we want it to promote flexibility, not end up with an overly rigid labour market. But there are other things in Europe, you know, that we could be doing, if you'd like to hear them.
Don't you think there are advantages in being isolated, though? You make a great thing saying we'll never be isolated. Mrs. Thatcher is your hero in some respects. Won the rebate for Britain by the very fact she was prepared to be difficult and stand alone and let Britain be isolated, and yet you say, oh, well, no, we don't want to do that. We want to get in there and we'll somehow manage to sort
I mean, that's
out.
a parody of my position.
Well, I'm quoting from you when you say that.
Yes, but that is drenched entirely out of context. Look, of course there are circumstances in which you're going to be isolated. I've said this myself on many occasions. Of course there are times when you're going to have to stand alone. But the judgment should be not to pursue isolation as if that were the goal of policy, but to pursue Britain's best interests. You take BSE. I mean, here we are with this government. I mean, I heard Mr. Major say yesterday, well, you know, what's it going to be like in these Amsterdam negotiations? This chap surely won't be able to handle it. BSE, you know, a year ago, the ban was put on. Then we had the beef war. Then Mr. Major tells us he's going to be able to lift it within months. Here we are now in April 1997, and not a single thing has been done in British interest. Now, that is not a British government getting the best out of Europe. The single market, the common agricultural policy, enlargement to the east in Europe, all these things Britain could have a positive, decent policy on and be leading in Europe, not following behind.
You've been accused by the Conservatives of chickening out of a television debate head-to-head with John Major. Would you publicly now say that you are still prepared to take part in a debate and what the terms would be?
Well, David, I've publicly said it just a few days ago, and I'm perfectly happy publicly to repeat it. We have made it clear throughout that we wanted this debate, but we're not playing games with the Tories. And what happened in those negotiations were that the moment it looked as if the negotiations were about to succeed, they pulled out. So let us have a proper debate about the issues in the election.
Mr. Blair, thank you very much.
Thank you.
The best players in your local school can keep the ball up 30 or 40 times. The best players in your local park may even keep it up 50 or 60 times. But as for the best players for Wimbledon or Chelsea, they only need one touch.
Yes, it's in!
Wembley's just one touch away for the FA semi-finalists. See Wimbledon v Chelsea live plus extended highlights of Middlesbrough Chesterfield. Sunday morning from 11:50 on BBC One and Radio 5 Live.
Mrs. Merton is rubbing shoulders with the stars.
We're in the USA of America.
She's going down a storm.
I really did want to meet you.
I'd like to meet you later.
Oh, you're great fun you are, you know.
Winning admirers and breaking hearts.
You look so much better than what people have told me. This is my room key. Yeah, I've got another one for a friend if you want it.
Mrs. Merton in Las Vegas. Thursday at 10 on BBC One. And it'll be...
Lovely.
An out-of-body experience for Perry Gilpin on BBC Two in a moment. The sci-fi drama at the Outer Limits. Harrison Ford's in action here on BBC One at 10 o'clock tonight, and he'll be on the wrong end of Sean Bean's personal vendetta in Tom Clancy's best-selling novel turned into a movie, Patriot Games.